Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
It is indeed a great privilege and an honor to welcome for the first time to this program author, historian Michael Schudson. He is at the Columbia School of Journalism, and his books include Why Democracies Need an Unlovable Press, Discovering the News, and The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life. Michael, welcome to the program, sir.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
I would like to talk about The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life, and let's begin with the key takeaway of the book, which is the fact that American ideals are ideas of citizenship, of democracy itself. Those ideas have truly evolved since the days of the Founding Fathers, and certainly since our days as a British part of the British colonial empire.
Yes, they have, and I think we really tend not to understand that or not to remember it very well. I think of the evolution as having gone through roughly 4 stages, and I think of these as 4 stages symbolized by the different members of the Simpsons family. So it begins in the 18th century with the age of Marge. This is an age in which the good citizen, that is what people really believed, our founding fathers believed a good citizen was a deferential person like Marge. Wise as she is, she knows her place and typically defers to perhaps not the best choice, but Homer. The people that our founders believed should be fully functioning citizens, which is to say white males owning property, were supposed to defer to the established and recognized social leaders of their community. That they were not expected to be following every ruling in the Supreme Court or every legislative action in the Congress, but to leave things to their representatives for the most part.
It was a citizenship of deference.
Yes, a citizenship of deference. This was followed, but not until the early 19th century, as political parties became organized, as the political parties became mass parties, and as political participation, newspaper reading, and other activities, organized civic associations, came into wide use. This I think of as the age of Homer Simpson. Remember that Homer spends part of his life at home and the rest of it, it seems, at Moe's Tavern.
Right.
The equivalents of Moe's Tavern were where political party activity took place through most of the 19th century. This was both where parties met, this was where sometimes polling places were located, and this is where voters would be rewarded after voting on a paper ballot provided by the parties, not by the state, for voting for the home team. And again, this is what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to be partisan. You were supposed to read the newspaper sponsored by your own party and not other newspapers. And you were supposed to vote publicly. There wasn't, in most places, there was not a secret ballot in America until the 1890s. Another thing we tend to forget. And political life was supposed to be celebratory, entertaining, the party in both senses of the word. Now, there was a reaction against that at the very end of the 19th century in the progressive era. This was Lisa's age. This was the beginning of the age of the informed citizen, where people were supposed to consider the different choices. The state provided a ballot, and you could compare and vote for a Democrat for president and vice president, or a Republican for the House of Representatives. You could not vote for the U.S. Senate because that was not popularly elected until the 20th century. But the idea that you should learn a lot and be literate, and there were increasing numbers of requirements for literacy, later to be notorious, but at the time that seemed to progressives to represent their ideal of what a good citizen should be. So Lisa was the kind of ideal of the informed citizen, and in fact that has, I think, remains for many academics, and I think most journalists, it's almost supreme belief in journalism, that that's what a good citizen is, someone who's rational, literate, and well-informed about the issues of the day. Now, this leaves out BART, and I should add that we still have elements of citizenship that are deferential. We still have elements of citizenship that are like the partisan Homer, and we still have many elements of both citizenship practices and ideals that are like Lisa. So where does BART come in?
So one doesn't replace another, Michael. They sort of build on the past, and there's this accretion of all coming together.
That's right. So, and BART at first I thought was hard to fit, but I now don't think so. BART has a view of citizenship in which he wants to know what's in it for him. He's both interested in rights, particularly his own, but sometimes that selfishness about what are my rights is very useful for the polity in general. And he's also irreverent, sort of the opposite of the deferential citizen. He's not going to give way to politicians just because they hold high office. In fact, he's rather skeptical about authority. And that model of citizenship, although it's never quite become normative in our society, there are more and more ways from the rights revolution of the 1950s and 60s, beginning with civil rights and the women's movement and gay liberation and other rights-conscious efforts, I think are not badly represented by BART. And yet this, I think, is the least digested of all of these models of citizenship, and still somewhat controversial one. It's the sum of these rather than any one of these that represents the best model of American citizenship.
We're talking with author Michael Schudson. Michael, I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't point out Mr. Jefferson's prescience. I am reminded of his line somewhere where he wrote that free government is founded in jealousy and not in confidence, that it is the role and the proper duty of a citizen to be jealous of any power in government or a power of an elected representative. I'm also reminded of his reaction to Shays' Rebellion, where he said the answer was not force on the part of government to arrest or punish people, but education, to inform the public of their rights and duties as citizens, not to punish them when they protested.
Right. And I mostly agree with Mr. Jefferson on this. That distrust of government is essential to democracy. It is possible, and I don't know how we draw the line on this, but it is possible that distrust goes too far, and distrust becomes a kind of reflex even when we should be recognizing that government needs some degree of, not a long leash, but some bit of leash, some room for its own maneuvering. And there I don't know if Mr. Jefferson and I would be in full agreement.
Yeah. Well, we see that every time the fire department rushes out to put out a fire. Citizens don't get up in arms and demand to know the details of how they fought that fire unless there is an accident or someone dies and the news is at work there. But I would agree with you, and I've talked with my friend Thomas Frank, the author, many times on this program, and he says, if we demonize government too much, we demonize that thing which the founders created to try to hold us together as a people.
Yes, and I think in many ways that government should be understood as one of the forces that shapes who we are and how we understand the world. I think much more than we suspect. We think of it as something far off in Washington that interferes with our otherwise perfect lives. There's a lot of American rhetoric that sounds like that, but the fire department is a perfectly good example. I mean, we could, I suppose, still have volunteer bucket brigades, but a lot more buildings would burn down that way.
Yeah. We're talking with best-selling and award-winning author and historian Michael Schudson of the Columbia School of Journalism. His books include Discovering the News, The Good Citizen, and Why Democracies Need an Unlovable Press. Michael, why do democracies need an unlovable press, and how does the press, a free press, the First Amendment, journalism, how does that fit into today's struggle to realize our ideals of good citizenship?
That book title I've stolen from quotation from Tocqueville, who, when he visited America in 1830, was very impressed in some ways by American newspapers, but distressed by them as well. They were vulgar, they were violent. Actually, one of the things he liked most, in contrast to his home country of France, is that they were spread out throughout the country rather than concentrated in the capital city. In his view, that was a very good thing because then the press could do less harm. But he said in conclusion, he said, I love the press more from considering the evils it prevents than the good it does. And I elaborate on that in my book and say that some of the things that media critics find most troubling about the news media are, I think from a Tocquevillian perspective, the various things that democracy most needs. For instance, academic critics and some journalists themselves routinely criticize the news media for being so event-centered. So what happened in the last few hours or in the last 24 hours? And they miss, therefore, a lot of the deeper and more fundamental processes of social and political life. I think Tocqueville would say, or at least I'm going to say, that the very focus on events is one of the saving graces of the news media, because events are unpredictable. Events happen when the powers that be wish they hadn't. And the events may be embarrassing or shaming, including embarrassing to power, government in particular, but other powerful organizations and entities as well. And in the normal, everyday run of events, journalists are under all kinds of pressures that they often cooperate in to be polite to the governing forces, to be deferential to leading politicians and public officials, and even to the concept and institutions of politics itself. The event, Hurricane Katrina, or another one, that government did not expect, did not anticipate, mishandled, reveal, and allow the journalists to reveal faults in our system and faults in our incumbents. And it's hard to, without events and that kind of fixation on events that the press has, for that release from the constraints of everyday reporting. You really need that. Similarly, conflicts, open conflicts, allow journalists a kind of leeway to be more pesky than they usually are and to represent a variety of viewpoints and sides. And so does, as we were saying earlier, a kind of generalized skepticism of politicians and politics. All of those are ways in which I think the press helps to prevent evils, even if it makes the press pesky, annoying, irritating, and sometimes irresponsible with respect to power.
We're talking with author and historian Michael Schudson of the Columbia School of Journalism. Michael, how are we to make sense and react to these two competing narratives? One that might have it when critics say the press is too liberal. they're just serving the political interests of the far left. And then this other narrative that says the press is completely controlled by corporate America today, and it only serves the interests of the wealthy and powerful and Wall Street and the 1%. Two very different narratives.
Right. And both have some support, I would say. I mean, that both have some legitimate support. Some years ago, the public editor at the New York Times responded to the critique of the New York Times that it's too liberal, and concluded that on standard Republican versus Democratic support of Republican versus Democratic candidates and a Republican versus a Democratic agenda, overall that critique did not hold, but it did hold, this editor thought, on a variety of social issues where there was a New York liberal bias toward, say, on topics like abortion, gay rights, and others. Now, I think you might be able to defend that, but I think the New York Times itself took that as a matter of serious self-critique in this case, and tried, perhaps failed, but tried to be more even-handed on social issues as well. Is the press, on the other hand, also too much in league with large corporations? Well, the main media are large corporations. They do have some natural biases, I think, in favor of business, or just matters in which they don't take by any means a left, or certainly not far left, view of who should own the means of production in America. They believe in a market system. They live off of a market system, maybe not quite as well as they did 10 or 20 years ago, but they do. So there are points to be made here on both sides. But what neither side, the press is too liberal, the press is too conservative, give enough credit to, it seems to me, is that journalists themselves, for the most part, there are exceptions, but most journalists are trying to tell a story straight. Now, they aren't always aware of their own preconceptions, and there's a whole industry which is now kind of democratized, thanks to the Internet, of media criticism, and there should be. But the reporters I know, and those we try to educate at Columbia Journalism School, we try to educate to get the facts. That's kind of basic, and I don't think people really understand how seriously most good journalists take that fundamental obligation.
We reach something of an impasse, though, in this day and age, where I guess journalists and, well, not journalists, but the people who employ them and the organizations that employ them have to ask a question, are we here to make money, or are we here to serve the ideals of citizenship? In the same way that we ask our government, do you serve liberty or do you serve power? These
are subtle and difficult matters to I think, to come up with a final judgment on. My own judgment at this point is that the best journalism will arise if the goals of news organizations are not completely consistent. That is, I actually think news organizations should be, in a democracy, somewhat deferential to government, and recognize that it's true. The journalists, did not get elected, and the politicians they cover did get elected, usually fairly, and that the politicians deserve a voice in and through the media to some extent. At the same time, I think there's benefit to the good journalism does if journalism has, to a degree, a serious interest in the bottom line. Now, by that I mean that they should have concern if they're not reaching people. They should have concern if they're not popular. And if you think about why it is that newspapers that had never paid any attention to women or women's issues thought that was beneath their dignity until the women's movement took off, Why were they suddenly just enlightened? Well, in part, yes, they were suddenly enlightened, but in part they realized that, oh, there's this other constituency out there that watches television and reads newspapers and magazines, and we could do ourselves a great service by writing the kinds of things that might interest that constituency. So I think market-oriented thinking is sometimes also democracy-oriented thinking.
Yeah, and certainly that's the long story of America, as we have seen these previously marginalized groups and women and Jews and people of color and Roman Catholics, and as they have knocked on the door and sometimes made doors where there were walls and demanded a seat at the table and said, look, this country is for me as well, and these rights apply to me as well, and I want to participate.
That's right. And if the world of journalism is not paying some degree of deference to government and some serious degree of attention to their audience, then are they perfectly independent? And isn't that what we should be seeking? I don't think so. I don't think anyone is ever perfectly independent. If they're not paying some deference to the marketplace, the populace, and to elected government, then they may wind up paying attention most of all to one another. Well, what do my friends at the cocktail parties I go to, what are they thinking? What would they like? What would they find most newsworthy?
Right,
and that has, as we know, serious problems of its own and kind of self-enclosed conversation.
We're honored to be speaking with author and historian Michael Schudson of the Columbia Journalism School. Michael, stay with me. We'll take a very quick break and continue this conversation in a couple of minutes. Michael, I want to ask you about hand-wringing on the part of the American citizen. It seems that every generation of Americans has, in its own way, has sort of wrung its hands and worried about the future of the country. And we certainly do that today. I do it on this program. You know, when we see headlines about the NSA or assaults on the Fourth Amendment, the militarization of law enforcement, this age of endless war, we have every reason to be rightly concerned about liberty, about the ideals of citizenship as we know them today. How are we to react, you think, without being hyperbolic? How do you see American citizens reacting appropriately to these kinds of news stories that would err on the side of liberty and the ideals of citizenship? And what's the role of the press?
That's a very tough question. Let me give a kind of framework for answering it. I may not answer it as directly as you asked it. The framework for answering it is that we have a number of political theorists that made this case, and I find myself quite attracted to this, that we've moved since roughly 1945 and even more since 1965, we've moved into a kind of post-representative democracy. That from the early 19th century to 1945, we were the way we govern ourselves was mostly organized and decided in elected legislatures and the executive branches that were related to them. After roughly 1945, these are very general dividing lines, there got to be much more power in the executive relative to the legislative, And there got to be simultaneously a whole set of new opportunities for citizens to participate in different ways. And you got, I don't particularly like the word post-representative because we're still a representative democracy, but we're some kind of I call it a trans-legislative democracy where citizen involvement is not just being a good voter, it's being someone willing to sue for one's rights. That's the sort of thing Bart Simpson would like. And we've learned a lot about human rights and civil rights in really the era since the civil rights movement, not just for African Americans, but for all kinds of groups of citizens and individual citizens. So going to court was not a way you tended to seek public goods in the 19th century or the early 20th century, but it is thanks to brave individuals and various formally organized legal organizations, left, right, and center, that we have many more public interest groups, including those representing lower classes than ever existed before in American life. Political parties are somewhat weaker than they were, but there's such an array of what some people are calling monitory or monitorial activities that citizens can participate in. It seems to me that you can be there's just a much larger variety of ways in which people can be good citizens today than ever before. Now, some of them are more effective or more far-reaching than others, and I don't think any of them, even all taken together, means we don't need brave and risk-taking individuals to lead the way. But I'm impressed with even simple ways in which, in this case, often government activity helps us to be better citizens without much effort or risk. You want to help the environment by recycling? Well, your city may very well provide for you receptacles to put those bottles and cans and old newspapers in, if you still happen to read an old newspaper. That's a way in which you can be a more useful citizen, serving the general public while cleaning up your garage, and the state or the city makes it easy for you. There's nothing wrong with citizenship being made easier. I think that's a perfectly good thing. And there's nothing wrong with a citizen expressing views and values through a voluntary organization. When you look at the voluntary organization from the point of view of its Washington office, you call it a lobbyist and you condemn it. But I think that's a mistake. You should recognize that a lobbyist to somebody else is a representative to you. I do think we have a lot of work to do to reconceive citizenship in a way consistent with the opportunities we have for citizenship today and the changes that have happened in the way our government operates.
And if the past is any guide, as your book, The Good Citizen, beautifully illustrates, we will perhaps continue to see evolving ideas of citizenship and democracy even in our own lifetimes.
I think that's right. I should have added, I've left out a member of the Simpson family. That's Maggie, and we don't know what kind of model of citizenship she's going to bring.
Where might it go, Michael? I'm just curious what your crystal ball. I know at the end of your book you talk about this watchdog citizen who is stressed out, very busy, has a lot going on, but drops in here and there when so moved, and is the type of person that's not at all afraid anymore to take to the streets with a sign of protest.
Yes, that's right. Protests, including street protests, Occupy Wall Street is one example, but the Tea Party is another example. And people are in general more willing, not less willing, to engage in protests of that sort. They only go so far. They only do so much. There's a lot of work that needs to happen after The momentary excitement of the protest passes, and it will pass, and the high that people get, and it really is a kind of high to participate in a mass demonstration, that fades, and then you got to get back to work, and you have to think about how that heady idea might be implemented, and how, if it is to be implemented, you might have to compromise, and you might have to implement part of it, not all of it. Exactly, I don't have any formula for how one does that, how you know how to do it. I do think there's a kind of ethos that goes with it, or should go with it, and that is that democracy is always an incomplete and always a revisable process, and one in which many groups, maybe not everyone, but many groups have to be relatively satisfied, and no group is going to be entirely satisfied. To know that that's the pragmatic reality of the day helps, I think, to figure out what comes next and which foot goes first.
Michael, in this age of new media, as we like to call it, although there has always been new media, but the age of the internet and independent journalism, and so this new era of journalism online, what do you see insofar as that new technology and how it might serve the interests of the ideal citizen and democracy, all of which, of course, is aimed at liberty? I mean, that is ultimately the goal here, is individual human liberty. Are we seeing this new journalism, or this era, this age of the internet, serving those goals in different ways, perhaps even more powerful or less powerful?
There is a danger, I think, with the new media, although I think it's less significant than the opportunities, but they're both significant. The danger is what happens to the bulwark, the fortress of the American news media, which has been the daily newspaper. Daily newspapers are, in general, in considerable trouble, and have been, from Craigslist on, I would say. I mean, they have lost most of their classified advertising. The business model that sustains the American metropolitan daily newspaper is in great disarray, and some newspapers now are instituting paywalls for their online edition, and maybe that's seems to be helping at the New York Times. But we don't know how unique the New York Times is in that respect. So the faltering of a long, quite successful business model for the daily newspaper is a problem that has arisen because of digital media. That's the danger. The opportunity is demonstrated by all kinds of developments online. You get we now have more nonprofit models of journalism supported by philanthropy. ProPublica is probably the most celebrated example,
sure,
where you have a reasonably large news organization, ProPublica, that is devoted entirely to investigative reporting. And they cooperate and partner with other news organizations to get the word out. Most people don't go online to the ProPublica website, although they can, but they read the results of ProPublica reporting in other news organizations, online, in print, on television. Often they partner with television as well. That's one kind of model. Blogging is another kind of model, including individual bloggers who are, like monitorial citizens generally, likely to be focused more on one topic than another, not all-purpose general interest blogging on all subjects, but they become quite expert. Some of them fully amateurs, not trained, but smart amateurs who know a lot about one thing, not everything else, and pursue that. And they can get the word out much better with the new media than they were ever able to before. So the interconnection of amateurs, professionals, specialists, generalists, people connecting other people to things they've read and noted. This is a kind of digital Wild West that has it's had great achievements already, and I expect there will be many more. Whether they can find ways to do this in a money-making or otherwise life-sustaining way for the people who work at them, that is still being worked out.
Yeah. Michael, I've only got a couple of minutes left, but before I let you go, I would be irresponsible if I didn't ask you about tomorrow is the anniversary of the resignation of President Nixon. Ken Hughes of the Miller Center will be with me tomorrow to discuss his new book. But one of your books, of course, is about Watergate and how we remember those years, those very significant years. What are your thoughts, given the anniversary tomorrow? I'm just curious, in a couple of minutes here, what crosses your mind on this anniversary of the resignation of Nixon?
Well, I'd say a couple of quick points. One is that when you look at how Watergate is portrayed in school books, which I haven't done recently, but I did it in some detail 20 years after Watergate. Now it's 40. But at that point, the one thing that seemed to me very important about Watergate that was all but censored from the textbooks is that politics was involved. Both the extreme partisanship and almost paranoia that Richard Nixon himself had about the Democrats, that was not emphasized. He did something wrong, but it's not terribly clear in most of the textbooks what it was, something about a burglary. And, of course, it was much more than that. But also, had the Congress, both houses, in fact, not been Democratic at the time, I don't think there would have been a serious investigation of Watergate. I mean, the Democrats were not only alarmed by what they thought might be going on in the White House, but they were in a position of power. It was a divided government, and they had partisan motives. They didn't only have partisan motives. I think they had patriotic motives, and I think they were deeply concerned about the power that Richard Nixon was taking to himself, Constitution be damned. And they should have been, and they helped the country by doing that. But, we shouldn't leave the politics out of it. The other thing I would add, just out of my own current research, which, among other things, concerns environmental legislation passed during Richard Nixon's presidency, incredibly important environmental legislation, including the law that articulated and stated for the first time that a responsibility for caring for the environment was a federal government responsibility. That's a law Richard Nixon signed into law in January 1970. Did he really care that much about the environment? He made quite an eloquent statement at the time, but no one seems to think he really cared about the environment. He was trying to prevent the Democrats from having a good campaign issue, allowing them to pass this law and then making it in some ways his own. He not only signed the law, he appointed people to the Council on Environmental Quality, which was the law established, who really took the environment seriously. So I'm not a big fan of Richard Nixon, but he does deserve some credit for, because he was politically oriented, he did terrible things, but because he was politically oriented, he also did some very good things.
Michael Schudson is at the Columbia Journalism School, and his books include The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life, which you should go out right now and buy, and of course, Discovering the News and Why Democracies Need an Unlovable Press. Michael, you've been so generous with your time. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and it has truly been a privilege to have you on this program.
Thanks very much, Coy.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.